Some of you may have heard a slight shift in the naming of this slot. It's now the voice from the bedside chair. Now that's really to enable us to bring you a wider pool of very well-placed guests who know what it's like to be at the bedside. And in the chair today is the magnificent, that's not in my script, I'm adding that, Jim McManus, Professor Jim McManus no less, who's a good friend to the art of dying well, and also the Director of Public Health for Hertfordshire County Council. Can we whisper it? President of the Directors of Public Health? Yeah, well, I've done it now. So, as you can imagine, listeners, quite a busy chap over the last 18 months or so with the rather unprecedented coronavirus and the response to it. What do I say apart from how are you, Jim?
I'm all right, actually. I think there have been times during the pandemic when I wondered if I would be like lots of people, but yeah, I think I'm good and hanging on in there and finding bits of light and grace in the midst of all this.
Oh, good for you. Yes, much needed, I think. Now, listen, today we are talking about men and how they handle dying, death, grief, different states, of course, on the journey. I'm going to start actually, because interestingly, Colin Brazier, a bit earlier on in this podcast, actually saw the merits in reclaiming some of that stiff upper lip, show must go on type of mentality. And I'm going to ask you, first of all, should we do that? Or as men be more in touch with our emotions?
I think it's quite mixed. I mean, there are some I think there's sometimes benefits to kind of holding it together until you can fall apart, as it were. So when my dad died, he died very suddenly, and I never got to say goodbye to him. And as the eldest son, and my mum was disabled, I had to do all the work of the funeral. And actually, it's awful. It's an horrendous time. You can't grieve because you're rushing around registering deaths. And it wasn't until after the wake, when I was doing some washing up, that I completely fell apart. I mean, really fell apart, pining and yearning for my dad, and felt lost like I'd never felt before in my life, despite losing, my gran and granddad, who were like parents to me because they essentially brought me up. So I think it's unhealthy to bottle it up forever, but as a coping mechanism until you can find somewhere safe to fall apart, I think a lot of professionals who work with grief do that.
Do you think grief is more likely to ambush men than women potentially, or is that a bit too simplistic?
Does feel like it in the experience of everybody I know of uh, because I think the expectation of masculinity and handling grief is not for all men, but it is often seen as something that is a gender trait that you don't want men to have. But actually, the whole point of male clergy, the whole point of uh, the tenderness of Christ should, I think, bring us back to the idea that men should be in touch with their feelings, and it doesn't matter whether somebody is heterosexual or gay. This is a problem across men. It's not a problem across sexualities. To the generalization that gay men are more in touch with their feelings isn't necessarily true either. Men have a problem in expressing grief.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, what can we do about that, do you think? How can we handle grief better? And then I will come on to death and dying as being, obviously before the grieving process.
I think we have to acknowledge that it's real, and actually say it's okay to grieve and recognize actually it's hard work. Grieving is hard work, whatever you're grieving for, and that it is part and parcel of being human is being able to grieve, and that's a sign of maturity and strength, not a sign of weakness. Now that's easier said than done, but being able to cry in front of people um, when you're sat in a meeting and you've seen other men cry because it's the first time they've been back in the office in a while, or because they've lost a friend, then respecting that and going with it, and not trying to stop people who are in there expressing grief, I think is really key.
Now, you've been in many hospitals, many hospices. Been on the board of trustees of hospices. I know you know plenty about that, and I know you've been at many bedsides. What about men who are dying? Are they, do you think, more prone to denial? Do they struggle to actually take this massive change in their lives? Do they struggle to take that in their stride, do you think?
I remember when I was 15, my granddad sitting in the Western Infirmary in Edinburgh and saying to me, when everybody had left the room and I'd given him his pipe, and he said, "I know I'm dying and none of that lot will tell me." And I just fell apart. And we had a really kind of sweet moment. And when he came back in, he said to them, "Look, I know I'm dying." And the best deaths of men whose bedsides I've been at are when they know they're dying and they prepare for it, the art of dying well, and when we discuss it. And I think we've got a real problem with that in our society. But I've visited people in hospices, I've visited people in hospital, and that kind of recognition has been a kind of moment of, if you like, sweetness and an ability to come to terms with it and be relieved. Um, and I think it takes great quiet inner strength to do that. And it's not the kind of strength that we expect of men. I don't know if I'm making sense.
Oh no, absolutely. But I am going to take you from the bedside chair into the bed because I know you're okay with me bringing this up. But of course, you've survived cancer as well. There must have been some very difficult times then when you look at your life and look death in the face, quite literally. How did you feel at the diagnosis stage? Did you think that was it?
I did, because when you told you got cancer, well, everything goes in one ear and out the other. And funnily enough, it was the 4th of December 2012. So it's less than a month at the time of we're doing this, so from the sort of 9-year anniversary, as it were. I took nothing in. Um, I must admit, I thought, well, that's it, I'm going to die. And the doctor said, well, you're going to have to take 3 or 4 months of work. And sort of looked at her and went, what? And it was complete shock and denial, and just numbness. Um, and I kind of, I went, you know how people say, well, you go through all these stages. Well, I went through numbness and shock, back to numbness and shock, straight into kind of grief, and then just into depression, and then back out of that into determination that when they said to me, look, actually, there's a very good chance with this type of cancer will cure you. But it was a very difficult journey because I'm allergic to opiates. So most of my painkilling journey, I couldn't have morphine because it's just awful. And I'd rather have pain than the side effects of morphine. Um, but the chemotherapy is foul. You lose a lot of weight. You're in because it was a blood cancer, you end up they try and kill your immune system, and you end up in a room where there's nobody around. So you lose your work. You lose your ability of people to visit you without kind of being masked up and gowned in case they give you an infection. When you're neutropenic, your immune system is destroyed. You can't eat anything other than boiled food or stuff that's been so processed it's not worth eating. You lose your appetite, and you lose your mobility, and you add to all of that the fact that you think you might die, and um, it becomes a very, very challenging time. And um, I don't think I've ever been quite so vulnerable in all my life, but funnily enough, that's been a source of strength. But the grief of my own potential death was very different from the grief of losing my father.
Yeah, that's interesting. So are you saying that you potentially started to grieve for your life while you were still alive?
I think I went into what I would call lament. That feeling of being forsaken by God, which lasted for a couple of days, and I was feeling sorry for myself. And then something happened. I got multiple infections, and I got pneumonia. And I think the doctors were expecting me not to make it, because I still remember the registrar coming in and saying, has the palliative care registrar been in? And I went, no, I'm not planning on dying. And it was after I had the sacrament of the sick that I got this immense sense of peace, and I thought, actually, this is not my time to go. And I can't put a finger on it, but I just got a sense of, no, I am going to be okay. And despite huge problems, multiple infections, and injections into my spine to stop the cancer spreading to my brain, and getting pneumonia, and all the usual stuff, actually, I came out the other end of it. Um, Admittedly physically damaged and still with some side effects some time later, but you just got a sense of, once I just gave up and thought, well, I'm going to focus on fighting this. And I said to the Lord, look, you know, this is in your hands. What do you want? And that was when I stopped saying, why have you done this? And I started to see it as an opportunity. And the grief actually eventually did turn into just exhaustion. And out of the other end, I came out the other end, and it turned into something that felt a bit more like resurrection. I mean, I went into hospital in the first week of Advent and came out, or was it the second week of Advent, and came out just before Holy Week. And somebody said it was the longest Lent you had, and I can only make sense of it in those terms. But came out of it actually with, this is going to sound really weird. I wouldn't want it to happen again, but I'm glad I experienced that level of pain, vulnerability, and fear.
Do you understand your life better as a result of that?
Yeah, it puts everything in context. It presses the reset button on everything. And I remember saying, to God when it finished, I said, look, right, I'm going to do every bit of good I can for as many people as I can for as long as I can, and the rest is up to you.
I do have one question, just rewinding a little bit. You know a lot about medicine, you know a lot about healthcare and provision and strategy, and you know a lot about nursing, and you're a trained psychotherapist. You've got so much knowledge. When you're faced with death yourself, does that all go out the window?
Oh God, yes. I mean, so none of your psychology training prepares you for your own mortality. You have to face that, and people are really good at coaching other people. They're rubbish at coaching themselves for the most part, because you can't stand outside it. You are faced with your absolute vulnerability. But I do think if you haven't had an experience of vulnerability, you can't encounter others quite as well. And I remember in my undergraduate degree, which was divinity at Glasgow, and we had this third year course which was pastoral care, pastoral psychology, practical theology. It was a very Scottish thing. And we had this semi-atheist, semi-Jewish consultant psychiatrist from the Southern General Hospital in Glasgow. I mean, you can just picture him. And he sat there one day, he took his glasses off, and he looked at all of us, and we went, you lot are only here because you need to be needed. And we all sort of sat there and went, ouch, ooh. And you could feel the buttocks clench in the room. It was a challenging moment. And he said, but that's okay, because as long as you recognise that, it won't get in the way of you helping people. And he said, but also remember, you're rubbish at dealing with your own problems. Um, and you can't heal yourself, you need other people. And it's so true, actually. It doesn't, I mean, you know what's going to happen, and you know the stages, but you know it more of a cognitive level than here in the heart. Am I making sense?
You absolutely are. But one thing I'd like you to leave our listeners with, as a man who has been through so much, who knows an awful lot about the healthcare system, a very kind, a very charitable man, you've given so much of your time outside of work. And I love what you said about, look, if I survive this, I'm going to help as many people for as long as I can. I think that's what a wonderful way to live. Goodness me, in this society as it is today. But one message to a man that is either struggling, with the spectre of death, or is recently bereaved, what would your message be to help them cope?
Reach out and talk to somebody, and find the strength to be open and honest about how you feel, and know that so many other men have gone through similar things to you and will go through them, and you're not alone. And that it is embarrassment from your friends maybe that stops them talking to you, but there are others who will listen. Please just reach out.
Jim, what a wonderful way to end, and thank you so much. I will leave you to carry on helping as many people as you can for as long as you can, because you're doing a fine job of it.
Well, thank you. It's the first time in a podcast I've laughed and cried in the same period for a long time, so I'll blame you for that, James. Or thank you.
Is that, yeah? I don't know whether I should thank you for that or feel rather bad about it.
No,
but
I'm grateful for that experience. Thank you. It's been lovely.
And I am too. Thank you, Jim.